Alright, the next big topic that we're going to discuss or talk about will be what we call theology of origins. The theology of origins, or the beginnings. The first book of the Bible is called Genesis, which is the translation of the Hebrew word Bereshit, which means in the beginning. So, talking about the theology of origins, we'll be thinking about how the Jewish people imagined what was there in the beginning. What was there first, so to say. When we talk about the theology of the beginning, the first point we need to make is the story of creation. The story of the creation of the world. Now, usually in theology, when we talk about the story of the creation of the world, it can mean two things. One is our world. But the other might mean the world as a whole. Sometimes we mean our world in biblical language and theology, but sometimes it means the whole created realm that is outside of God. Everything that is a result of the divine creative action, or creative movement. So the Bible has something to say about what was there in the beginning and what was not there in the beginning. So the story of creation plays a very vital part in the biblical narrative. So the first chapter of the Bible tells us the story of creation in a very poetic, in a very rhythmical way. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it then follows a story of 6 days of creation. Plus 1 day of rest. The total number 7, which is the natural cycle of the week. 7 days equals 1 week. And that's how we measure time. Right? So the story tells us how God created all life as we see it and as we know it in 6 days, including human beings, plus 1 day of rest. And that later on will become the pattern of life. So the story of creation explains how human beings are to live their life. Now I'm already getting into the theology of it. Why? Because later on God will give a law in which He says, you shall work for 6 days and on the 7th day rest. Why? Because God created the world in 6 days and on the 7th He rested. He sanctified the Sabbath. So basically by working 6 days and resting 1 day, human beings imitate God in their own reality. They're active for 6 days and on the 7th day they sanctify everything they've created and they have a chance to evaluate it. And so then the question is, how much of this story that we're so familiar with, explains how things really happened in the beginning and how much of it is actually a pastoral concern about how people live their lives. We don't know that. We don't know that. We live in 21st century and we would like to believe that the Bible and the biblical text agrees with science. And that actually this story of creation, of 6 days of creation, is a scientific account of how things worked, how God worked to perform this miracle of creation. But we cannot be sure about that. We don't know how much that is technical and how much the writers of this text wanted to reveal their understanding of how God did everything. I'll give you an example. The first thing that God created was, after heavens and earth, is, or was, light. Let there be light, and there was light. That was day one, right? And so, on the second day, He divided the waters. On the third day, He made the dry land. And what did He do on the fourth day? The sun, the moon, and the stars. And He hung them on the firmament, right? Now, we have 3 days of light, but absence of sun, which we all know is the only source of light in the world we know, in our world. So how come there were 3 days of light that were measured somehow, because there was day and there was night, day one, right? There was night and then there was a day and there was a night, day two, day three. Then on the fourth day God creates the sun. So we know to measure the days and the nights by the shining of the sun, right? Because it says that when God created the sun and the moon, He created them to rule over the day, sun, and the night, moon. So they are our measurements. They are reference point, if I can say that, if I can express myself. So it becomes clear that once you get into the technicality of the story, you understand that there's an obvious, or let's say, something that appears like a mistake. Even to the simple-minded people of the past, it's very clear that there cannot be days without the sun. So how can we have 3 days without the sun? Now, I already told you a few things about the writing of the story. The first thing is that it is poetic. It's a divine poetry. How do we know that? Well, there's a rhythm. God says, and it was rhythmically, right? Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 9. You have these rhythms. It's like a song with a rhythm. It's very clear from first read. It's poetic. Okay? But then the second thing that this story is apologetic. What do we mean by that? Well, all the cultures that surrounded Israel, all the great religions of the great empires that in certain cases enslaved Israel were sun worshippers. Right? To them, the sun was not a mediator of the divine. It was the divinity. That's why most of the pagan cults related to the sun. I don't know whether you're aware of that, but without any exclusion, all the temples in the ancient days, in the pagan religions, are oriented towards the sun. Their entries are towards the east. So when the worshipper comes into the temple will be oriented towards the sunrise, and the sun will be worshipped and praised at the point of sunrise in the temple. Not only that, but in most pagan cults, there were important days as celebration in the temples. And that were the days of the, how do you call that? Solis? In English. Help me out here. When the day and the night become equal, this is the equinox, right? There are 2 days of equinox, spring in March and fall in September, when the day and the night are equal, right? And so these are days in which light from the sun would enter into the deep part of the temple, in places which are something like the Holy of Holies. A beam of light would shine into this. And that was a time for special celebration. So the sun was the sun god for all the people.
We have a festival. It's
Every religion, believe it or not, something similar happened in Israel. I mean, the entry of the temple is facing the east. For what reason? But it was common practice. Anyway, so the Jewish faith differentiates itself from the sun cults or the pagan religions. So, when the people who wrote the story of creation, chapter 1, and I believe that Wellhausen analysis is right here, he said that Genesis 1, the first story of creation, was written by the priests, the P tradition. So this is P tradition. Priests are concerned about temple and temple cult, temple worship. For them, the sun is a mere physical body that is placed somewhere in the sky. And by the way, for them, the sun was part of the earthly order. It's part of the earth. That's how the earth works. Our world. Without the sun, we're lost. But anyway, since they place the creation of the sun on the 4th day, they totally annihilate the possibility of sun worship. According to their narrative, the sun is not created even as the first of God's creations. And that's how they secure a faith that does away with the sun cult. But they just displace it. They have no problem with this. Why? Because they cannot, and they don't want to tell us objectively how everything worked out. Because this story is not only poetic and apologetic, it stands in contrast with the faith of others, but it's also liturgic. In other words, the priests needed texts by which they organized their faith in a temple ritual. That is their concern. And so you need to know that in the Jewish temple, there were sacrifices that were offered throughout the week as a thanks offering for everything that God has created. The sun and the moon, the green grass and the trees, the animals, the birds, the light, the dry land, the human beings, in a weekly cycle. There were morning sacrifices, there were evening sacrifices. So basically this story is a liturgical text that organizes liturgical life within the temple. And of course, because we have lost the temple and because we are religious but we don't practice temple religion like the ancient Israelites, we have lost those meanings. Now, we are technical people. We think technically. We don't think in terms of poetry, right? So we understand only the technical things that this story tells us. We don't see it as a great poetry, right? Now think about this. Poetry makes certain claims. You have poets in your country, right? And you know, poets play with words and concepts. And that is the beauty of poetry. And that, you know that somebody does poetry when they mess with your mind, right? Why? Because we have certain technical categories of thinking that makes us unable to get beyond, to understand the vastness of life, right? We're so arrogant, we think that we figured everything out and we know it all. But when the poet comes, he starts messing with your head. Everything is different, everything is possible. And now the question is, okay, poetry is a not technical way of saying things. Poetry messes up with categories that we have fixed, right? But is poetry false? Is it a wrong way of speaking? Is it? Now when the prophet Isaiah says that when Messiah comes, the trees will clap their hands, is he wrong saying that? Since we know that the trees have branches and not hands, and that they cannot clap but make noise? Well, he's wrong technically, but he's right, because his poetic language expresses something that the technical language cannot. And let me tell you, God can be explained in some ways, but he is beyond every explanation. And poetry agrees that God is beyond explanation. So basically, poetry is a language of limits. Poetry gets into another, how shall I say, another realm where we lose our stability, where things are fixed and we know how they work. And amazingly enough, God has chosen poetry as a major way of revealing himself. Unfortunately, we don't read in Hebrew to understand how much of the prophetic speeches and the prophetic messages are poetry. But again, the fact that they're poetry doesn't mean they're false. Now, we're not only technical, but we've become superior. Now, I speak from the perspective of a European citizen who lives in a well-established country, in a well-established Christian country, in Christian civilization that dominates and has dominated the world for a very long time. And you know, when you're superior and when your faith rules over all the other faiths, you don't need to be apologetic because the others are subdued. They're considered primitive and they're deprived of the right to speak. Right? So we don't get the apologetic dimension of this story, because we don't need to argue with anybody. We are right. Everybody knows it. Now, we're no longer liturgic. I don't know what phrase to put here. But we've become very secular. Very materialized. There's no mystery, there's no liturgy, there's no divine rites, there are no actions in temples that symbolically represent higher realities. We are in the technical, we're in the secular, we're in the material world believing we figured it out, we know how it works. Now, if you read Psalm 139, it says that it's a psalm of David. David explains the miracle of conception and birth. and he blends it with the creation of a human being. I'm wonderfully and marvelously made. You have such a great thoughts about me. They are so much higher than what I can reach. While I was in the depth of the earth, you were working me, you were creating me. My uncreated substance was before you. You wrote all my days in your book before even one existed. It's interesting that right there, David blends the creation of Adam from the earth with his own natural birth from the womb of the mother. This is a typical Jewish thinking. You blend two things together. So basically the creation of Adam and the birth of David become one and the same thing. But anyway, to David, the birth and the creation of Adam was the greatest mystery, the greatest miracle that God would perform. So it's written in a very poetic language. But today we know technically how the conception takes place, how the baby develops within the womb of the mother. We can explain all of this, and you know what? We don't offer sacrifices to God to thank the fact that we have experienced a miracle, a childbirth, any longer. For us, this is normal. And it doesn't have to do anything with the temple. It has to do with the hospital. I'm trying to unravel before you how you read the Bible. You read it with modern lenses. But we believe we're very competent and we know what this text wants to tell us. Although it was composed by people thousands of years ago, for people that lived thousands of years ago in a very different way. So don't ever think that this story of the 6 days creation and 1 day of rest told us everything that was there to say about the creation of the world. Because if you believe that, you'll be a fool. You'll start thinking that somebody sat down and wanted to give us an extensive narrative of how God made everything. But you know what? If a person was there to tell us how God made everything, then our Bible will be only the story of creation and a lot more. And we will be lost. Totally. This is a very brief sketch which is poetic, apologetic, and liturgic. And if you know that, you will be a lot more faithful to interpret it accordingly. Alright. So, according to Jewish understanding, God was before the beginning. So we have an eternal God who is not part of the world that He creates. And think about this. According to the theology of the story of creation, the first story of creation, God creates the world with a word. So this, and God said, is very instrumental. Why? This is another theological issue that the story wanted to encounter or to confront. For example, here in the East, it's in Hindu religion that you're very familiar with, God and the world are the same thing. So basically, God does not create something out of Himself or different from Himself, but He manifests Himself in a new way that becomes the world, right? As far as I know Hinduism, that's the explanation. So in Hinduism, there's no creation story because God is not a creator in the sense of creating new reality. Everything that there is a new way of Him manifesting Himself. Am I right? Is that it? Is that how they explain it? Yes or no? I was looking. That's how they explain it, right? So God and the world are one and the same thing. So basically everything there is in the world is some sort of divine manifestation in different degrees, right? In different degrees. But again, everything, the sum of everything is the divine, in which we are part, which we are part of, right? But in Hebrew theology, the Hebrew concept of divine human relations or relation between God and the world, God is totally different than the world. And He speaks the world out. So there is no ontological connection between God and the world. The world is brand new reality. New reality, non-existent reality. That's why later on in history, in the development of doctrine and dogmatics, both in Judaism and Christianity, it is believed that the story of Genesis 1 tells us how God created the world ex nihilo, out of nothing. You need to know that. Ex nihilo. Out of nothing. So, from eternity, there was only God and the world was not there. And in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So He spoke them out of nothingness into being. He spoke them into being. Which means that this story, if that's what the story tells us, there's an ontological gap between God and everything that is not God. This is fundament of the Jewish religion. There's an ontological gap between God and what is not God. What is ontological? Probably some of you will know it, others not. Ontological is the word that you need to know if you're a faithful student of theology and philosophy. You might see in thick books the word ontology or ontological. It comes from the word from the Greek word on, which means being or existence. Being or existence. So basically, ontology is the science that relates to the very nature of being or very nature of existence. Right? So when we say that there is an ontological difference between God and everything that is not God, we mean this. God exists and God is in a very different way than us. He is ruled and governed by different principles than ours. For example, one of the principles of our existence is space and time. We're spatial beings that are subject to time, right? This is what drives our existence. But God is not of this world. And He's not subject to the principles that drive our existence. In other words, He's free of our limitations. He's out of space and He's out of time. He can demonstrate Himself into space and time because there's compatibility between God and the world that He created. But He's totally free from the laws that drive our existence. Right? This is very important to say because this becomes the foundation of the Jewish faith. That's why The Jewish people will never worship trees, never worship waters. They will never worship the celestial bodies. They will have a totally different understanding of what the world is and what is the world's matter. How to treat it, in what way. This is very fundamental. Another thing that is important. Since God is not of our world, and since our world and God are not one and the same thing, God can identify with the world. God can play by the rules that He has established in this world, because it's His creation after all. But He is free of it. It means the following. That this world is subject to mortality. Why? Because it's born out of the nothingness, out of nothing. God is not out of nothing. God is out of Himself. And if something was not there at a certain given point, now this might sound very philosophical, but it's very important. If something was not there at one point, it might come into existence, but it might come back into the non-existence. All right. So to continue my thoughts, the idea that God is different than the world that He creates, and that there's an ontological gap between Him and the world, is very important foundational belief, both in Jewish faith and in Christianity. So, God is a self-sufficient being. He Himself supports His own being, and He Himself is the reason for His own existence. But we cannot say the same about the world that He has created. God is the reason for the existence of everything that is not God, right? And what God has created the world free of Himself, but dependent on God. This is a very interesting relation, so to say. The world is free of God because it is a different reality. But it is dependent because God is the source of life, and God is the cause and the sustainer of the world. So, let's do this. Let's paint. God is the supreme reality. We don't know whether reality corresponds well with God. He's beyond all reality, but for the sake of the argument, and because of the need of explanations, we'll use the word reality. God is the supreme reality, the supreme being. He's the only reason why He is. Nothing causes Him, right? But God creates the world. In which we live, right? And God causes the world out of nothing. So imagine this dark thing here is the non-existence. I'm painting it. This is just an abstraction. The non-existence does not exist. Okay? Think about this. Before you were born, you were not there. You were in the nothingness. And nothingness is not something. It's nothing. It's just non-existence. Okay? But again, when we paint, we need categories to think. Right? So, out of the nothing, out of non-being, God calls the world. And then the world exists. The world exists free but dependent. How can you be free but dependent? Well, you can be free in the terms of you and God are not one and the same. Your way of existence is independent, different from the existence of God. Because you and I and the angels and everything God has created is a totally different reality. In that sense, we're free. We're not stuck with God from the moment of our existence, right? God is around us, but He's not determining what we decide, how we live. He's expecting us to accept Him freely, because if we're not free from God, then we don't need to accept Him. Do you understand what I mean? Now think about this. Even the doubt, is there God? Shows us that we're free. Because if we were not free, we'll never doubt. Because we will be melted within God. And the question, is there a God, will not exist. Alright? Think about this. Now we are enlightened by the light of the day. Now, when you're enlightened by a light, can you ever raise the question, is there a light? No. It's apparent. You're in it. Right? But if you're in a dark room and the light is out there, you might be doubting that there is light. Same with God. God is different. We're free from God. He's out there, but we need proof. We ask questions. Is there God? We doubt it. Because we're free. Yet we're dependent on God. Why? Because He is the sole source of life. And because He is the life sustainer. He's free from the world, but He constantly sustains the world. So He creates, and then sustains the world. And you have this in the story of creation of man. This is the second story in which God breathes breath into the nostrils of Adam. Before that, Adam existed as some sort of a statue made out of clay. Independent reality of God. Then God breathes breath into his nostrils and he becomes a living being, a living soul. He's free but yet dependent. And then in the book of Job there are several places in which we have this statement that if God takes His Spirit away, pulls His Spirit back to Himself, and stops breathing His breath upon the face of the earth, all living things will go back in the dust, in nothingness, in other words. Right? Why am I saying this? You'll understand why. Because on this philosophical understanding becomes the foundation of the idea of redemption. Of what it means to be saved. Of what it means to be redeemed. So since the world is here, existent free from God, but dependent on God, and God is present in the world, but not obvious, but present, but not present, but not obvious. Now, a little later on, I'll show you that there is a difference. This applies mostly to our world, to the material world that the Bible calls earth. That is not the case for the angels. The angelic reality is enlightened by God, and there is no doubt there that there is God. Okay? So the angels never doubt. They have no right to doubt. Because God is apparent. It's right there before their face all the time. Right? But in our world, God is present but not obvious. And now, since the world exists, there are two it can travel. One is the way of unification with God, union with God. One is the way to unite with God. To totally agree and harmonize itself with the divine existence. Harmonization, union with the divine existence, in which the world receives by grace what is natural for God. Eternal life. By grace, the world that is united with God receives what is natural for him: eternal life, perfection, holiness, immortality. Or the world disharmonizes, detaches itself from God and comes back where it came out of, into the nothingness. So, the separation of the world from God brings disharmony between the divine way of existence and the world's way of existence, and the world gradually falls into nothingness. And we call this death. We call it death. Death for things that exist means to go back to non-existence. We know that individually. We know we are born and we know we die. But both Jewish and Christian belief systems explain the death as an act of separation and disharmonization with the divine, which we call sin. We explain that by saying we did something that sent us into the wrong way. We have mistaken the road, right? We took the wrong turn. The idea was total harmonization and union with God, in which everything that exists, everything that is created, receives by grace the eternal life of God. But you need to know that this happens as a second act. What do we mean? We mean that the first act is the act of creation. Getting out of nothingness is the act of creation. But the second act has to come after creation. I wonder whether I shall use a word which we in the Eastern Christianity use very often, that was part of the early Christian tradition. Unfortunately, a term very foreign to the Western Catholic tradition, and very, how shall I say, puzzling for you because you come from Eastern beliefs. It might shock you at first, but I will say it anyway. The early church fathers believed that the point of Christ dying on the cross and resurrecting was not just to fix the problem of sin, but to restore us to the initial idea of God, of total union of everything created with God, which they explained with one single term, which in Greek is theosis. And in translation it means deification. becoming divine. Now, I told you that this term might kind of ring the bells within you, because in Hinduism, for example, people talk a lot about deification. But then think about this. In Hinduism, people are deified in the act of creation, right? So if you're deified from the start, why becoming divine? You are already divine. Now, in Christian theology, theosis or deification means something else. In Christian theology, we realize that we are created non-divine, as a non-divine existence, that has the chance to live eternally only if God unites Himself with it as a second act after creation. In other words, in the first act, God creates us, and in the second act, He unites Himself with us to give us eternal life. Otherwise, we fall to nothingness and die. So, the world is not immortal from the beginning. The world is created for immortality. That's why it has to receive immortality by grace at the end. This is Jewish belief. This is Christian belief. So immortality of the world comes at the end, where God, by grace, gives His eternal life to what is not eternal. And what is the guarantee that this will happen in Christian faith? It is the incarnation. It is God coming down into the world, becoming part of the world, to secure the fact that the world will unite with God. And why I'm using the word world, not humans? Because humans represent the world, everything created. And our destiny is the destiny of our world. Once we're united with God, everything is united with God through us. So, the idea is this. And now this is a statement which you might want to write down, because it's very essential. God did not create everything He created eternal. In the beginning, God did not create an eternal world. That would be the simplest way to put it. In the beginning, God did not create an eternal world. But in the beginning, God created a world destined for eternity. In other words, God intended the world to be eternal. But in order the world to become eternal, God has to unify Himself with it, with all forms of life that He has created. And this, in Christian theology, happens in the point of incarnation, where God becomes the world by becoming flesh. And by allowing the life that flows within God, that makes God's existence existent, to come down to us, to become available for us, and to give us the life that we don't have by nature. Is this too complicated? Is it too complicated? This is systematic theology already. You just write it down, one day you might get it. So, again, it's very important at this point, if they ask you anywhere, on a test or on a paper or in a conversation, is the world that God created perfect in the beginning? No. It was created for perfection, which means that first it has to be created and then made perfect. Was the world that God created eternal? No. But it was created for eternity. Which means that God first creates it and then intends to communicate His eternal life with it via unification. Adam was supposed to to unify himself with God completely, in mind, heart, and body, and attain what Jesus attained for us, eternal life, which comes out of the union between us and God. So, not eternal, but for eternity. That is the point. Now, for example, there's a verse in the Bible, and there are a few other verses like it. Verse, let's say, 104, Psalm 104, verse 4, or rather verse 5, Psalm 105, I'm tired, sorry. Psalm 104, verse 5. Now, Psalm 104 is the other creation story. It's very important for you to know that complements Genesis 1. If you wonder if there are other stories of the creation of the world, or other texts that tell us about the creation of the world, Psalm 104 is one of those texts. And so in verse 5, we have the following statement. He, God, set the earth on its foundations. It can never be moved. There's another text, if you want another text. Now think about this. It can never be moved. Say Ecclesiastes. Chapter 1. Verse 4. Now Ecclesiastes is wondering about endless cycles of things, repetitive things. And he says in verse 4, chapter 1, generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. There are a few other psalms, and one of them is mentioned in the book of the Kings. It's a psalm of David, where David praises God, and he says this: "For God has established the universe, and it can never be shaken." In other words, people like David realized that nothing can undo the act of creation. Once God has spoken the world into reality, it will always be there. But that doesn't mean that always be there means eternal. And I'll tell you how. Do you know that human beings can potentially multiply themselves endlessly? Human beings can potentially multiply themselves endlessly. If there are normal conditions of life, human beings can multiply without an end. And in that sense, they can always be there, eternally. But you and I will not be there eternally. Humankind might be, if there are normal conditions. Right? So, this endless multiplication that always brings new people into the game is a bad immortality. Why? Because some people that came into existence disappeared. I'm here, and I've replaced David. I've taken his place in the space. But the tragedy is that David is no longer there. And he was the beloved king, the king after God's heart. So, Jesus wept when Lazarus died. He could not have said, well, another one will be born in the same village, don't worry, there will always be people around. God's tragedy is the fact that people like David and Lazarus died. Why? Because once brought into existence, they're supposed to attain eternity, eternal life. That's God's point. God does not want anyone who comes into existence to disappear from existence. So now, you understand that it's not enough for God, for humanity to be around and keep on multiplying endlessly. It's not enough. That's not the deal. And that's why the Jewish people believe that the death of human individuals is tragedy. That one day God will fix by resurrecting them from the nothingness and bringing them into eternity. Alright? So this is the easiest way to put it together. Now I will finish with this following thought. Genesis 1 explains how the world was created. But Revelation 22, 21 and 22 tells us how the world became totally unified and harmonized with God. In other words, how the world became immortal. And when I say the world, I mean everything created. The end of the story is unification, union with God, of all things with God. And this is being beautifully explained also by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now I'll give you the exact verse. Verse 28.